Hello and welcome to another episode of ZenChats, a show where I have real conversations with real project founders. I am Zeneca, and today I'll be talking with Omar from Gratitude Blooming. Gratitude Blooming is a different project. It's just built different. It has a strong focus on self care, mental health, and gratitude. It's right there in the name. Over the last 10, 15 years, I think we've seen culture, especially in the West, shift more towards, meditation has become a big thing. Mindfulness has become a big thing. And gratitude is just another way that we can, think about our day to day lives and approach things in honestly, just a better, calmer way, a more appreciative way. And so, yeah, Omar talks about his history, his past working. Basically, yeah, we get to hear his story and then how he came to be in the NFT space and what this project is all about. And it's a breath of fresh air, honestly. So I hope you enjoy it, and please like, subscribe, follow, all that jazz. And let's jump right in. Hello, Omar, my friend. How are you?
I'm doing well, Zeneca. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much for being here. Yeah, we've known each other for a while now through Zen Academy and the gratitude circles you've hosted there and some other conversations we've had. But I'm really excited to chat with you just longer form and get to know you better and hear about your journey. Yeah, both in and outside of NFTs and Web3. Thank you for being here, really.
There's life outside of NFTs and Web3.
Yes, apparently. Even though it really doesn't feel like it sometimes. Like we're in this crazy bubble uh, that it's almost like, at least for me, I NFTify everything. Like I was at dinner earlier today with Rachel, my fiance, and a mutual friend of ours that I haven't seen him too much lately, and uh, I was talking to him about a project that I was advising on, and he was like, "Oh, what are they? Are they looking for tickets?" And I was like, "No, I think they just want to do the standard. Like they're doing a comic and then a PFP drop and all this kind of stuff." And he was nodding along. He was like, "Yeah, yeah." And then Rachel was like, asked him, "Do you know what a PFP is?" And he was like, "Nope." And so I just assume that people understand the lingo because of how much we're in this space. But yeah,
Yeah, GM doesn't mean good morning to everybody.
no, no, it doesn't. It has other meanings. But we're here to talk about, I mean, many things, but one of the focuses will be on gratitude and your project, Gratitude Blooming. But maybe tell us a bit about, yeah, your background and your relationship with gratitude.
Yeah, I mean, I have a gratitude practice because that's not where I started.
Yeah.
It was a more of a place that I got to really because I was stressed out. It was 7 years ago that I was leading a large scale initiative to revitalize the Los Angeles River. And for me, it was the culmination of a career in that I've always had a deep passion for real estate and sustainability and community. And, I'd been in finance and real estate equity, but it was always about like, how do you do good with it? But I hadn't had the right opportunity until I was invited to look at revitalizing this 51-mile public resource in LA. And yes, LA has a river. Most people have only seen it in movies.
I've
The
been
old
there
school.
like 3 or 4 times. I still didn't know that.
Yeah, most people don't. I grew up in LA and I didn't know we had a
Yeah.
river. It was an opportunity to really think at scale. And I think, not to like weave Web3 too much into the whole conversation, but I'll just say that what I loved about the LA River was that you're really thinking about large scale infrastructure, right? Like, and infrastructure is really what do you want a place to be in 20 to 30 years? Because it doesn't happen overnight. And something like the LA River is really integrating green infrastructure, which is like, how do we better use our water? Like 70% of all the rainwater in LA drains down the river. And I think Web3 is really, well, how do we actually want to organize ourselves in different ways? And one of the things I love about it is that it really, in some ways, bridges two very difficult things, which is autonomy and interdependence. And how do we both kind of recognize our own individual needs, and how do we do that in community. And so anyways, I was getting to do it. It was a dream job. I was working with Frank Gehry, literally probably one of the most famous architects in
Wow.
the world. He did Walt Disney Concert Hall here in LA, the Guggenheim in Bilbao. And, it was one of those things where when we first met him and we had like our pitch, we're like, hey, how should we, present this to him? And we threw out our pitch deck because we said, whatever is in his head is probably cooler than anything in our pitch. And so we're just going to go with the challenge, which is, this is 51 miles. 1 million people live within a mile of the river. Everybody's got different ideas about it. So how do we create some coherence? And his response was, this sounds crazy. I'm in. And that's
I
like been
love it.
kind of my like go-to mantra for things, is like, that sounds crazy. I'm in. And that's one of the lessons I learned from him, was like, he said, if you know the answer already, it's not very interesting. And so how do you sort of question and discover things? And he's 93 and he's still going strong. Somebody posted last night a news segment on him and like 3 new projects that he's got going. And
Wow.
so it's also about just longevity. Like, how do you think about these things? But for me, it was also just super stressful because literally everything I did was in the newspaper, local, national, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. 1 million people means there's about 3 million different opinions as to what this should be. And democracy is great at many things, not necessarily great at infrastructure, because
Yeah.
everybody can say no and very few people can say yes. And so I got an opportunity from a foundation to take a step back and look at how other places in the world were looking at infrastructure. And so I had on my plan to go to Singapore, Indonesia, Holland, which is underwater. And so all these places really think about infrastructure in very different ways. But I told them I wanted to go on a 6-day silent retreat first. And they were like, "Oh, Omar, you're mistaken. You didn't get a sabbatical. And I was like, I'm not asking for a sabbatical. I'm asking that I first get to go inward before I go outward. And I'd never done anything like that. But I felt like, when in my life is somebody going to essentially pay me to like go follow my interests in these
Yeah.
very intentional ways? And so I went up to Big Sur, which is in Northern California, looking out over the Pacific Ocean, beautiful, right up in the hills. And I did a 6-day silent retreat. And I didn't know if I was going to go crazy. I didn't know if I was going to achieve enlightenment, but I was, like, hey, I want to go do this. At the end of 6 days, I got to talk to this monk. And I told him that in all of this silence, what was deafening was how impatient of a human being I am. And, he put his hand on my shoulder and put his face right up to mine, and he laughed at me. And he said, the root word for impatience in Latin is patis, which means to suffer. And he says, that is your burden to carry. And I was like, this is like terrible advice. I don't like it. Thanks. Like 6 days of silence, and
Yeah.
all I get is, you get to suffer.
Yeah.
And so I was like, well, how are you supposed to get things done in the world and be non-attached at the same time? Right. And, he said to me, non-attachment does not mean indifference. So you can still care and be non-attached. Right. And I think, in the Web3 context, where there's like tons of volatility, right? Like, you're excited, you want to do things. How do you hold that excitement and be non-attached at the same time? And I was like, I want to figure that out. And I heard about meditation, and I was like, well, you know what? Maybe that's the way to go. And so I meditated every day, twice a day for 6 straight months. And at the end of 6 months, I realized I was just as stressed out as I was normally. I still had a very
Okay.
demanding job. I still had 2 young daughters. I still had a beautiful partner who I wanted to be, a good husband to. And so I was like, well, this is clearly not working. So let me try something else. And, I heard about mindfulness. And so I was like, well, maybe it's not about like carving out time from my day. How do I just be more mindful throughout my day? And I was like, okay, that sort of helped. But it wasn't until I stumbled into the practice of gratitude that something like fundamentally shifted in me, that like just pausing to notice something good in each day actually made me feel better. And I think what I learned was that I thought non-attachment meant like, in some ways, like transcending my feelings and emotions. But what I've learned over time is that it's really about learning to feel your emotions without having to become your emotions. That you can actually sort of acknowledge whatever that feeling is in the moment, and then also sort of recognize that that feeling will then also pass. And like, how do you actually do that in a consistent way? And so I'm like, this is amazing. I love it. I feel better. People around me feel better around me
Yeah.
being better. I ended up sharing it with a friend who happened to be the head of digital for the Oprah Winfrey Network. And he's like, this is exciting. Oprah obviously talks about gratitude a lot, but this was sort of like a slightly different approach. And we ended up raising some friends and family money, launching a gratitude app. I had left my job, and like, it's been sort of a wild journey sort of ever since I literally was in private equity. So this was like the
Yeah. Wow.
furthest thing that I sort of imagined for myself. But there was this quote that really resonated with me at the time, which was, everyone thinks about changing the world. No one thinks about changing themselves.
Hmm.
Leo Tolstoy. And I was like, what does it mean? My whole life, I've in some ways driven by this idea of like building the world I wanted to live in, right? And real estate and
Mm.
infrastructure was very tangible ways to do that. But at the end of the day, I've come to just really appreciate that how much culture makes a difference. And if you think
Hmm.
about climate change and some of the big sort of challenges of our time, we're not going to build ourselves out of the problem. We're actually going to have to shift culture, and like, what does that look like and mean? And culture at the end of the day is just, what are those daily practices? Like, what are those routines that we have? How are we showing up? And that really then to me is like what I'm now trying to focus on.
That's such a wonderful journey. It's, I mean, you watch movies about people going from, private equity or this high stress finance driven job and into, becoming a monk in Tibet, or, just really transforming their life or drastically changing it. But it's rare that you meet someone who's actually made that shift. But yeah, it's just wonderful to see, because just talking to you, I can tell that you're coming from a place of like calmness, and
Mhm.
it's clear that you found some sort of level of inner peace that a lot of people might not have had the fortune of finding yet. But I want to. I don't know if you mentioned it, but when exactly time wise did all this happen? Was this like a year ago, or was this many years ago?
So the deep journey into like meditation, mindfulness, that was about 7 years ago. And then ago is when it was like, okay, I wanted to like actually what I do every day, I wanted to do something different. And then we launched the app was named Thanks, GTHX. We wanted to be fun and irreverent.
Hmm.
We did our US domestic launch on Thanksgiving in 2019, and it was like great numbers. We like the subscriber conversions were
Yeah,
like on par with Calm and Headspace. We're like, yeah, we're gonna crush it. This is amazing. And then 4 months later, COVID hits, and we're like, boom. We just sort of
yeah.
like we were knocked like everyone else. And we made, I would say, a strategic error. And it was in some ways for all the right intentions. We were like, you know what? Gratitude is this incredible antidote to all this stress and fear that people are feeling. And so let's not hold our antidote back. Like, let's give it
Mm,
away for free. And what we learned was people don't always value something that's free.
yeah.
And the practice takes work. And so part of the practice, when you pay for something every month, you're like, well, I'm going to use
Mm,
this. And
yeah.
so that sort of took us sideways, and we had to like reshuffle. And so last year, um, we brought in a new CEO who really has like more of a content background in film and TV production, as well as like meditation. We're like, all right, let's create a different content pipeline. And I was like, I want to go do something else. So I still have an interest. But one of the things I ended up doing during COVID was hosting these weekly gratitude circle sessions.
Mm,
And at the time, it was like purely organic. I mean, literally, like the first time I did like a Facebook Live, I didn't even know where like the button was, like the UPS guys like banging on the door, and like,
yeah.
you're just like figuring it out. And I'd been holding in-person gratitude sessions, and we had like this whole like a friend called it like a gratitude dojo. Like we had these all like these stations, and I was like trying to recreate that in the digital side, and it did not translate. And so, I was hosting different friends who were like meditation teachers or wellness teachers or mindfulness. I think there's not one way. I think there's many ways. And so and I figured when we were sort of mostly all in lockdown, like if we can't be in real life, let's be at least in real time. And it was like a very grounding experience. And we had people from, all over the US join each week. And one of those people that I had was the co-founder of Gratitude Blooming,
Mm.
and really based on this 39 card deck that this artist who spent 100 days illustrating 100 different plants each day because she wanted to move beyond sort of inspiration into the practice of discipline. And what does discipline teach us in a different way than just sort of like, hey, what am I inspired with today? And through that practice, paying attention to one single plant each day, in some ways, nature started to speak to her, right? And like
Mm.
a word kind of came to her as she illustrated each plant. And her friend was like, these are so beautiful and these words are so powerful. Let's create something. So they selected 39. And what I've learned over time in holding these spaces and circles is sometimes self-reflection is difficult. And so a prompt is helpful. The other thing is that having a third object, and I have them, right here,
Hmm.
like a third object allows us to project our sort of focus on something else outside of ourselves, which then makes it easier to talk about ourselves, ironically. Um, and so I really like the combination of the physical aspect. I love the combination of nature. Remember I worked on the LA River. And, I think one of the important things about sort of integrating the nature element is that we live on this rock that's hurtling through space,
Yeah.
right? And when we pause to realize that we're on this rock hurtling through space, it's a very quick to be like, okay, I'm part of something much bigger than myself. And that's really an essential element to gratitude. Gratitude is a social emotion that's inherently in our biology, to be reminded that we're not stuck in our own sort of egocentric view of the world. We have that bias, and we also have the bias of often seeing things in a negative way. And so how do you break those biases? And some of this is generational. We pass on, like, your parents had challenges and they had habits, and you're like, why do I do that? I'm like, oh my God, I'm acting
Mm.
like my mom or acting like my dad or whomever, right? And so how do you break these chains that are often passed on generation to generation? For me, my impatience was really about wanting to sort of control my environment, right? And on the one hand, that's great. It's autonomy, right? It's sort of self-determination. Entrepreneurs always say, like, the best way to predict the future is to create it, right? Like, that's the ethos. The negative side of it, though, is sometimes if you're building things out of fear because you're trying to actually control everything and you're not willing to be present to the unexpected, then there's a negative aspect to that sort of idea. And so for me, like, how to deal with that fear, and like for me, like sometimes my impatience showed up as being quick to anger. And I was like, you know what? My mom and dad sometimes, why are they so
Yeah.
angry? And I'm like, oh, I'm now doing some of those things. I don't want my children to carry that on. So how do I break that cycle? And really, I want my kids to be able to process their emotions and their feelings in a different way. I'm part Asian American, and I would say on both sides, but I grew up mostly with my mom. Didn't talk about feelings and emotions. It was not a
Yeah.
sort of a topic. It was like, think before you talk. I remember my uncle, would say that to me as a kid. Omar, think before you talk. And so this idea of feel before I talk was like, what? I've
Yeah.
never heard of that thing. What do you mean feelings? What are those?
Yeah, I mean, I can relate. I mean, I have my parents are Indian and very similar, did not talk about feelings much at all growing up. It wasn't like stifled or like not uh not a thing to it wasn't like bad to talk about them, but it was never like as open. It just wasn't a thing that we spoke about at home very often. Yeah, and then I definitely had to go through phases in my adult life of discovering how to talk about or how to feel things, really, just how to feel, or how to know how to feel. Like it's so strange to think that some people have to go through that, but it's just
Well,
part of life.
it's our ethos. You think about mind over matter, right?
Mm,
Like we think outside the box, like, and I think I just posted this recently because this VC guy on Twitter I know, relational greater than rational.
mm,
And it was the recognition that just because you think you're logically right doesn't mean that you're actually in good relationship to the people around you. And it, funnily enough, his wife was like 20 years now into it, thankfully. I was like, oh my God, that's awesome.
wow.
And so we have, particularly in the West, this sort of individualistic mindset, like logic rules everything. But we know that people aren't logical, right?
No.
We're not the rational sort of creatures that economists sort of, modeled. And so we really do need to find a different vocabulary. And I think for me, like even in the space of meditation, like people talk about, oh, meditation, and then you become more mindful, right?
Mm,
I've sort of come to the belief that where it's like, well, gratitude actually helps us become more heartful. Do we need to
mm,
be more mindful or do we need to be more heartful? I mean, the reality is we need both, right? But in
mm,
terms of like swinging the pendulum back a little bit to some equilibrium, how we learn to deal with our emotions. This is what, in some ways, I love about the Web3 stuff is like full acknowledgement with FUD, right? Fear,
yeah,
uncertainty, doubt, right? Like we own it. We're like, hey, I'm throwing FUD. I'm feeling FUD. It's a thing. It's there. It's not this sort of mystery. Like people are now willing to identify it. But then the question is, are we also then equipping people with the tools to actually process it?
yeah. No, I mean, everything you're saying makes total sense, and I think for a lot of people, myself included to a large extent, in terms of sort of self care, meditation and mindfulness are very much. They became things I became aware of and known, and like I heard about them. I used Headspace. I meditated, practiced mindfulness, but and I think a lot of people, over the last 10 years have come to know about meditation. Maybe 30 years ago, it was an esoteric, a thing that the East did, but it wasn't really into the Western cultures yet. But meditation and mindfulness came in, but I feel like gratitude as a concept, as a practice, has not quite reached the same levels of yeah, just what's the word? Where it's just
Yeah.
ubiquityness. Yeah.
Well, I think it's one of those things where it's almost so obvious that we can't even see it. Right?
Mm,
Like we're thankful. Oh, we say thanks all the time, but we don't actually really mean it in some particular way. Or we mean it, but it's not actually tied to a practice. And so I think, and even if you look like a Google word search trend, like gratitude is like here and, meditation is definitely way
mm,
up higher. But, this is what I like to call the original wearable technology, right?
hmm,
Like for thousands of years, people literally had mala beads, prayer beads, every, in some ways, culture, religion has some form of this.
mm,
All it is three things. It's a reminder of an intention. It's something very simple, which is counting your blessings. And the reward is a healthier you. And so, in some ways, science is now catching up to what
mm,
spirituality has long known. But I would absolutely agree with you. It has not really entered into that sort of pop culture zeitgeist beyond like journaling. And,
mm.
I think journaling's cool, but it's not, I would say, the most it can be transformative, but in terms of like how to engage in it, I don't necessarily think it's always the most accessible.
So how would you engage in gratitude?
Yeah. I mean, having launched an app now, like creating with Gratitude Blooming, we created our own Discord and we've created a gratitude bot using those 39 cards. We're about to launch, some NFTs around it. I would just sort of say this sort of the way that I simply kind of break it down. Like if meditation begins with noticing each breath, mindfulness begins with noticing change, gratitude begins with noticing good. So in each
Mm,
of those practices, what you're really learning to do is bring attention to your noticing. And once you start becoming more aware of your noticing, so then how do you do that, right? And I would say then there's sort of like 3 levels to that. So the one is the easy, right? Like, oh, thank you. Someone does something for you and you say thank you. Even that is interesting. I would say, and I don't know if this is just a US thing or not, but oftentimes somebody will do something for you and you'll say, oh, I appreciate it.
Mm.
You don't say, I appreciate you. You
Mm.
say, I appreciate it. You're appreciating the action, not the
Yeah.
person, right? So even just at that base level of like, next time somebody does something nice, are you acknowledging the person or their action? Because if you're
Mm.
acknowledging just the action, then you're just acknowledging the thing that's benefiting you,
Mm.
not what the person, like, what did they actually do? Like, and who they are as a person.
No, that's such an important distinction. Yeah.
And then the sort of second layer is in that pausing to notice good. And like with that, it's really about becoming more specific. And this is why, again, I don't know, this is more of a US expression or not, but pause to smell the roses, right? And it's sort of a couple of things. Pausing, right, first and foremost, not just sort of like running through life,
Mm.
but pausing. And the other thing that I love about that expression is that you're not just pausing to look at the rose, you're pausing to smell it, right? And this is where gratitude, I think, is really an embodied experience. Meditation and mindfulness, in some ways, are very conceptual ideas, whereas gratitude is an embodied experience. You can actually feel it. And so,
Mm.
whatever your practice is, it's not just about writing the things down. It's actually the feeling of it, right? Like, how am I actually feeling when I do these things and acknowledging those things? And then the third sort of level to it, I like to call it fearless gratitude. So if gratitude makes visible what you value, what you're inherently also doing is acknowledging everything that you're making invisible and taking for granted, right? And so when you can start to see what are the things that I'm taking for granted? What is it that I don't really want to pay attention to? And how do I actually start to be open to looking at those things in a less judgmental way, right? Like, so for me, where is this impatience coming from, right? Yeah, I can sort of frame it in the egocentric world, which is like, I want to build things, right? That's why I'm impatient. I want to do all this good. Yes. And I have a certain amount of fear that I'm holding about uncertainty. And like that was my way of creating control. And so, unless I'm willing to look at that sort of shadow side, then it's always there, but I'm ignoring it. And then therefore, I'm not really able to see things as they truly are. And so, I feel like those are the sort of levels of gratitude, just beginning to acknowledge people, right? I appreciate you. Being able to sort of acknowledge the sort of the things in your life that when you're like, oh, I feel this. Like somebody gives you a cup of coffee, you're like, oh, I feel the warmth of the coffee. I feel the generosity of it. That is what I think of as like emotional muscle memory. Oh, I'm now learning to notice and name these feelings, and therefore it becomes easier to recall them, particularly when times are then difficult. And then it's sort of, I think the deep work is like, how do I really open myself up to all the things I really don't want to, but that are there? And, how do I actually deal with those things as opposed to like sweep them under the rug?
Yeah. I mean, it's you've given me every time you speak, I'm like, I get so many new thoughts, and I'm like, I want to keep pulling on threads, but I want to bring it back to this is meant to be about somewhat about NFTs and Web3. At least I think some people come here to hear about that side of things. So, how did you enter into this crazy, crazy world of Web3 and NFTs?
Yeah, a buddy of mine uh, talked to me about it. I don't know, 6+ months ago, and I obviously like heard about Bitcoin and all that before, but my bias was like, oh, I'm not into speculation, right? Like I'm into building things,
Mm.
so that feels like just speculating. And it was a podcast with Tim Ferriss and Chris Dixon,
Mm.
who really started to break it down. And all of a sudden, they said, well, yes, there's the currency element. What I didn't know was the coding element and then
Mm.
the DAO structures, the decentralized autonomous organizations. And like, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm on whatever, like fifth or sixth company of building and creating things. Some successful, not right, but I love building. And I was like, oh my God, those are all the building blocks you need. You need money, You need to be able to
Yeah.
organize people, and you need to be able to create things. And I was like, I'm done. I'm in. Like literally, I bought Ethereum that day. Like I was like, I
Wow.
bought into a buddy of mine is Kaigani Turner or Kai Turner. He's a co-founder of Block, and we worked together 20 plus years. My first job out of college was teaching at a community technology center in East Palo Alto. And so it was literally like mid 90s, ground zero of the digital divide. Stanford is literally on the other side of the tracks. The street I worked on was called Whiskey Gulch because there were so many liquor stores and bars. There's now
Wow.
like a Four Seasons or something there. But we were teaching kids how to not be consumers of technologies, but creators. I was always more interested in the people side than I was on the tech. He did much better, like staying on the tech side. But he had just left a job at Netflix, and he had wrote a Medium article about why I left my job at Netflix to sell JPEGs or something like
Yeah.
that. And I was like, well, he's one of the smarter people that I know in this space. And his partner, Bart Deckram, was actually the founder of Plugged In, the Community Technology Center. And he also has been a huge innovator and pioneer in space. And I was like, well, these are the two smartest people that I know. One of them just left a really good job. And I listened to that podcast and I was like, I'm in. And I bought a Meebits DAO membership. I didn't even know what a Meebit was. I was like, I have no idea what a Meebit is, but
Yeah.
they created it. And so I'm just going to buy in. I'm sure hoping that and I couldn't afford a Meebit, because I bought in when Ethereum was like 45 plus $100, but they created a Meebits currency, and I was like, well, I'll buy that. Hopefully that does well now with the Larva Labs or Yuga Labs.
Yeah.
But that's really, I think, what's been exciting and I think having that sense of agency. The other side of it that I'm really interested in is on the DeFi, and like literally, I think it was Alchemex that has the self-paying debt, and I was like, they're totally rethinking debt and equity. Like I'd been in the world of equity and finance, and and just on a personal level, I've had equity in the market, stock market, and like when the market tanks, all your value tanks, and you're like, oh, that hurt, right? Now all of a sudden, if your debt is tied to it and your debt goes down by half as well, you're like, that's not so bad. I'll pay off that cheap debt, and I'm kind of comfortable that the market's going to bounce back. And now all of a sudden, I just made money by actually having the market go down. And I was like, anybody can make money on an up market. It's making money on the down market that's actually fascinating. And so I think like I said before, I'm fascinated by infrastructure, and I really do. Like if software eats the world, like Web3 is eating software like all day. And so to me, then it's like, how do I create spaces and opportunities to align everything that I value? So everything that I'm doing now is Web3. So that's obviously both on the gratitude side, as well as I'm still involved in some real estate and community finance stuff, and like building our own currency and like creating these sort of local economies that align community values with community wealth. And I think part of all of that too is redefining wealth. I think forever, and this is, I would imagine, part of the sort of just industrial revolution, everything became a widget. Time became money, and time is not money. And I think redefining our relationship to time and thinking about time affluence, like what do I really want to do? What is it that I really want to value? And then how do I actually create a lifestyle or the means to support that? And that's really my hope with Web3, is that we really create different ways in which we can create value and show value. I mean, like the fact that an NFT has all this value, starting with art and redefining an artist relationship, we've already in ways begun to sort of separate or redefine value and trade value in meaningful ways.
Yeah, I say this a lot. It's truly some sort of revolution. I think that we're at the very early stages of. I don't call it a digital revolution. We've already had that, like, in a way, but it's like digital ownership. It's just something. It's different. It's just feels different and empowering. Empowering is a really good way to think of it.
And that's where, like, in Web 2, it was all about network effect, and it was like dominance. You need to be the biggest. You need to like raise the most money, take everyone out, and that's how you gain market share. And I think I don't know, for me, I feel like we're moving from that network effect to an ownership effect to that word.
Mm,
Like, so what does it mean then we all of a sudden like actually have the means of our own production and creation and value that we can be our own bank, right?
yeah.
Like, and then we can have a bank to bank type relationship is a very fundamentally different sort of approach. And I think, but this is what I also love is, what you're sort of introducing with Zen Academy is the fact that like mindfulness and gratitude are also valuable, and this is my hope. Like, I'm just, put it out there. Like, my hope is that we create for like, what Calm and Headspace did for like apps and Web 2, how do we actually do that for gratitude and for Web 3, right? And even to like today, we did our Thankful Thursday. It wasn't just you
Mm,
posting, hey, I'm going to create this hashtag Thankful Thursday, and it's going to be under my brand only, right? Like, we
mm,
collaborated with Lost Boy, which, it's great NFT focused on music and mental health, and
yeah.
partnered with Gratitude Blooming. And so then all of a sudden it's like, we're already partnering in different ways. It wasn't this network effect mindset.
There's very much a there's just so many win-win-win-win situations in this space and mutually beneficial things. And I think a large part of it is because people understand that like a rising tide lifts all ships. It's like we can all benefit if we all work together. If we and at the end of the day, we still have ownership over the things that we create, but we can still help other people. And yeah, you see it all day, every day, just win-win-win situations, like nothing I've ever seen before in my life, and it's amazing. It's this collaborative thing rather than a competitive thing. And even most of like the rivalries out there, they're all fake. It's just like it's just not real. Like apes versus punks. It's like I think 99% of apes and punks holders were like understanding that hey, if one does really well, it's probably good for the entire space and will be good for them. And
Well,
yeah,
even more ironic now that apes bought
yeah,
punks, but
apes bought. Yeah, yeah.
so that'll be another interesting evolution. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's a whole other story. But you have your own NFT project now, or you're part of an NFT project. Let's talk a bit about that. How did that come about, and what are your goals with it? I would say, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the artist Arlene Kim Suda, who spent the 100 days illustrating, each of those plants and really listening to nature, those were translated into these physical card decks, which we then translated to a digital deck that we used in Zoom to hold gratitude circles. And so, but it's always not been a really clear product fit, not to use like jargony language, but like most people don't think of gratitude and then like going to go buy gratitude cards for prompts,
Mm,
right? Maybe people think about buying a journal and journaling.
mm,
And so it was always this weird like category that didn't really exist. And so now, and then I was like, hey, this is actually art. People actually understanding that buying art in this form makes a lot of sense. And then I think people assign a sense of identity and value to the art that they're buying, right? If you're not
mm.
just flipping them, right? Like if you're like, hey, this is representing me, or these values, or this community, they're representing me. And so then all of a sudden I was like, this is like the perfect kind of place for us. And so we're we've got 39 cards, and she's making that transition from being like a pen and paper artist to digital. And she like literally in the last couple of weeks, she's like, oh my god, I get it now. And like layers, and like all of a sudden
Yeah,
like really being able to mix medium. And I have to say they look amazing already. Like
yeah.
the other partner, we were like, I want to buy that one, and we are like, no, I'm buying that one. We're like already starting to like outbid each other on this. So we're gonna start small. This is gonna be more of an organic growth thing, but so we're gonna start on Tezos. Whether we do the hand drawn, or artists sort of develop generative art, or we actually end up doing a full blown on chain generative piece, we're
Hmm.
still sort of going back and forth on that. I think we'll probably do some additions of that, or the generative art, and a 101
Hmm.
of at least one or two of the cards. We're in conversations with some other big partners and collaborators, which would push out the sort of scale of what we're doing quickly. Um, and and I think that's again part of this idea of like, how do we build a gratitude movement of now? right? Like, how do we make just the simplicity of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, imagine if your NFT becomes as symbolic as a mala bead or a prayer bead, and you're just like, oh, this is my reminder, this is my touchstone, and I own this.
Mm.
This is mine, and it's my way of constantly reminding myself of the intention that I want to hold in this space. Um, and then, and then I think there's going to be some fun things that are going to be created out of it. And we are already obviously holding circles. We have a gratitude bot on our Discord, and so how people use them, experience them, I'm just excited to sort of see what happens.
Yeah, I love your approach. I mean, for starters, launching on Tezos, I think that's something that a lot of people don't even consider. They think, oh, everyone's on ETH mainnet, we're gonna launch there. But I'm a huge fan of. I mean, there's such a wonderful art community, especially on Tezos. It's much more affordable. It's environmentally friendly, um, and for smaller collections, especially, I think it makes a ton of sense. So
And
yeah,
some of my favorite artists, I mean, I made the switch just because I was like, I like their art, and
yeah,
I'd only been buying on Ethereum, but I was like, their art is so cool that I want to, and Gap launched on, and I was like, well, if Gap sort of they could have chosen any blockchain,
yeah,
and I was like, well, they probably saw something there that aligned because they're obviously a mass market, consumer brand, and
mm,
so for me, I was like, well, if they're paying attention and there's already some cool artists there, let's start there, and let's do this right.
mm,
This is not about generating a bunch of FOMO and
yeah,
like a bunch of mystery. I'm like, oh, this is going to be
yeah.
the most
That's
amazing thing, and and creating that sort of fear-based hype. And I think that's and this is why I love collaborating with you, is like, how do we still bring awareness? How we take hype?
mm,
Like, hype's not bad. Fear-based hype, maybe, right?
yeah.
How do you create hope-based hype? Can we do that?
Mm.
Like, that feels compelling and interesting, and really create a momentum around how do we want to show up? Like, what do we want the next 20 to 30 years look like? And if we're in some ways the pioneers of the space, then the values that we hold are going to be that much more important for everybody else that follows.
I love that. I love what you said about how do we make hope-based hype. It
Yeah.
reminds me of I'm reading a book. I say I'm reading. Last time I read it was like a month ago, but I started reading this book, and it talks about the concept of FOMO and then also JOMO. So
Mm,
instead of the fear of missing out, the joy of missing out, and
yep.
how yeah, just how there's like real value in understanding that losing something means that or like not having something or something bad happening to you is a net necessity in order to appreciate the good things in life and when things are going plainly or well. And yeah, it's something that's really missing in this space because everything is about FOMO or FUD, or fear-based hype, like you said. It's infinite regret. It's like there's always this space is 24/7. There's always something you're missing out on that you could have done better, and you see people all around you making squillions of dollars, and it's very easy to compare yourself to them and think negative thoughts. And it's a narrative that I hope that we can begin to shift and change a little bit, or give people more avenues for finding refuge or communities that are more focused on, yeah, hope-based hype. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think if Web 2 in some ways was defined by like social media and the look at me, right, model, like, notice me, and this
Yeah.
practice is about really noticing, right? Not me, but just the practice of
Mm,
noticing. And one of my favorite poets, Mary Oliver, she says that attention is the beginning of devotion, right? Like, what
mm,
we pay attention to is really what we're committed to. And so what we notice then all of a sudden matters. Like, it's sort of like vegetables. You are what you eat, it's like
yeah.
you are what you notice. And I think this is why I think the fact that Web3 has DeFi and is created to economic value and creation, if we can get to a place where people aren't moving in this feast or famine, scarcity, exuberance sort of mindset, I think Brene Brown said it best. The opposite of scarcity isn't abundance. The opposite of scarcity is enough.
Hmm.
And so then all of a sudden, if we can define what is enough for us and actually feel good about it, then you're just playing, right? Like
Yeah.
you're creating. I mean, I would say like you're crushing it as an example where you could still be trading and trying to kind of build out that portfolio.
Mm.
But the fact that you're like, you know what is valuable to me now is building community and sharing knowledge and learning, and then creating an economic structure where I think your NFTs is one of my best ones that I've bought so far. I think it's like a 10x, or it's close to a 10x. I think I haven't checked, but like,
Something like that. Yeah. It's gone down a bit, but yeah.
but I think more people obviously are still going to come in, but the fact that you just created it is that way. Like the previous model, the guru, like influencer model was like, buy my book, take my class,
Mm.
join this, but the economic flow is only one way.
Yeah.
Right. And so the fact that you've created it as an NFT where other people now can participate in that upside and then have value. I mean, that was partly like, I was like, hey, I normally charge a fair amount for holding these gratitude circles for
Yeah.
companies. But for me, I'm like, hey, I'm actually a member of this community. If the value of this community goes up because I'm holding space for it and like we're building relationship, then like that's all good. And we can now collaborate in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just the power of Web3 again. It's beautiful. It's like you said, we're kind of all in this together now. And so yeah, I'm seeing so many amazing initiatives and people who have ideas for how to add to the community, and just because they want to, like, not even necessarily thinking about potential financial upside, just like, hey, I enjoy hanging out here. It would be cool if we had this, that, or that feature. Let me, I'm willing to start working on it. And people have created such cool, like, little um, artistic, whether it's stickers or like, just taking the crystal ball and creating some nice art piece that people can share. It's just like people are having fun with it. And we have these creative writing prompts now that people are really, really enjoying. And yeah, it's power of community. It's sort of like, it's been the buzzword of the last, I think, 12 months in the NFT space, ever since pretty much Bored Ape Yacht Club is like in their word, in the word in the name. And then we saw this like community form around it. And then it was, I think, also in part to COVID and people being stuck at home in lockdown, like people were just craving companionship and relationships with other humans and connecting. And NFTs have allowed these communities to form in a very different and real way. Like, we always had the internet. People could always go online, join forums and Facebook groups and stuff. But now, if you can all coalesce around an NFT that you all own and a shared interest, and there's some sort of just more real. It's almost like growing up, I felt like we were playing with like play money. It's like it's not real. It's just like, but now it's like, all right, this is this is the big leagues, and it's a double-edged sword. It can go well, it can go poorly, and there's risks obviously involved, but it just feels more real, I guess.
Well, that's the reality, is that the risks are there regardless, right? Like
Yeah,
I've, had a decent amount of money in the stock market. And I went to grad school, and literally the year I went to grad school, I went from being able to pay for 2 years of grad school to 1, right? And I
yeah,
did everything right, like portfolio, like the whole 9. I was like, well, that didn't go well. So ever since
yeah,
then, I'm like, losing money is just like part of the process. And like, this is no different, but
yeah.
it's the fact that you are given the agency to go do that. And then the fact that there are things like these self-paying debt
Mm,
products that are being created, then that are mitigating risk, that sort of say like, hey, you know what, if you can get 5-6%,
yeah.
take the money out and it'll pay itself off, and that's your comfort level of risk, great,
Mm,
here's a
yeah.
product for you, right? Like if you want to leverage up to 70% and like go bet big on something, well, hey, that's on you too. But like,
Yeah.
I think we're going to see a portfolio of things, right? And I think maybe that's what the gratitude blooming NFTs is, us starting to like define new categories of NFTs, right? So some NFTs are just going to be PFPs. Some NFTs are like generative art. Some NFTs are around your wellness and like your value. So, and then some are like access to membership, right? Like Zen Academy. And so we're going to become a little bit more discerning about like, oh, okay, this is the primary purpose, not the only, but like this can have a clearer lane and value for why we have it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think let's talk about when are your NFTs launching? Like, say someone's yeah. Do you have a date in mind?
We're looking at the beginning of April.
Okay.
The art is looking where we want it. We're just putting together some of the technical aspects of it. We're trying to be light and agile. And really, this Genesis project is really just the tip of the iceberg for some of the other pieces that are coming in place. And so we're like putting those partnerships together now, and then really sort of thinking about how do we build community in an organic way. This is not going to be like some big 10,000,
Mm,
NFT drop. I think I'm more interested in like what are a series of drops look like that sort of build community in a way that's sustainable for the long haul. And that's, I said at the beginning here, I'm not a speculator, I'm a builder, and
mm.
I've built large scale infrastructure. I've built a lot of things. And to me, like Web3 isn't about today and tomorrow, it's about the long haul.
100%. I'm seeing more people also come to understand that and move from whatever initially attracted them to the space. Some people it was building, but some people it was the art or speculation and get rich quick and whatever, and then realize they spend a few months in here and they're like, oh, this is incredible. I want to build. I want to be part of it. I want to shape the future, and
Yeah.
we can shape the future.
Yeah, my business partner in Gratitude Blooming, she also runs a 10-acre retreat center in Mount Shasta. And, I also am co-hosting this Twitter Spaces with this Full Spectrum Capital, which looks at aligning financial capital in sacred ways. We had this Native American from Mount Shasta 2 weeks ago, and he's like, how do we help this Native American community have ownership beyond casinos?
Hmm.
And how do we introduce ceremony into cryptocurrency? And so to me, like, there's these like really innovative forms of community building and a much more inclusive way, because you don't have these sort of gatekeepers that have historically existed. And this is where the composability of Web3, where I'm like, hey, he had been stressed out about the tech. And I was like, I've got some other people who can handle the tech.
Yeah,
You worry about the ceremony and how to get your community involved. And then really think about what does, yeah, like how does indigenous communities show up in this space in a very different way than they could even, in real life.
yeah.
I
No,
mean,
that's just wonderful. Yeah,
yeah. So we're building,
uh,
we're building values, we're building an ecosystem. We're not doing this alone. And just like I said, the fact that we were able to do a little hashtag Thankful Thursday with a few of us
yeah.
just shows that this kind of collaboration is possible.
Yeah, and there's seemingly more projects and communities coming out that are mindful of self-care and
Mhm.
especially in the Web3 space, which is wonderful to see.
Yeah,
I think we're going to see more.
yeah. It's sort of trite to say, but the only difference between wellness and illness is we versus I.
I'd never heard that before. That's
And
great.
and like if we want wellness, then we have to think about we, not I.
Yeah,
And this is gratitude as a social emotion. It's inherently relational, and so we want to build the NFTs really to build community. Um, we're not building community so we could sell NFTs, right? Like it's
yeah,
actually like, no, we actually want to figure out how the NFTs actually serve the building of community. And let's be honest about our values. And I think again, connecting it to nature. And I think climate change is a very real thing. And so how do we actually shift culture and values is going to be way faster than, building new infrastructure.
yeah, 100%. Where, if people are interested in learning more and joining your community, what are the best places for people to find you
So we have a
and the project?
website, gratitudeblooming.com. We're on Twitter at gratitudebloom, not blooming. We have to find that person that has blooming.
Yeah,
And then, from there you can get on to Discord. And, I honestly have had so much fun with our gratitude bot. It's kind of ridiculous. I'm like, I have to remind myself, like, this is a public space, and where I gotta modulate my use of this. But at the same time, it's the whole point is to show people like, hey, we can have all these different feelings and emotions, and it's okay, right? You're not alone. I think that's the sort of thing is that we sometimes forget that, like, oh, am I the only person feeling this? And I think the word, in some ways, another way to say community is belonging, you know, and I think that what's beautiful about some of the things that are happening with NFTs is that we're redefining who gets to be part of community, beyond geography and, you know, a lot, because you don't know. Like, I love holding the gratitude circles on your Discord, because
Yeah.
all I see is everybody's PFPs, and I was like, well, there's a
Yeah.
dead fella, there's a, you know, boss beauty. That's all I know,
Yeah.
and I have no idea who is the person. But in some ways, because they get to show that, they can also be maybe a little bit more vulnerable and open to who they are. And so I think that's also a paradox, is that
Yeah.
people can actually be more open and honest in some of these settings than they were, you know, certainly on Instagram, where you're sort of, you know, shooting the gram and it take 2 hours to try to get the perfect shot
Yeah. And then you
for
add it
something
with
that's not real.
filters and everything, and
Right.
yeah. Yeah, that's wonderful. We'll put links to all of those places down in the description below, so anyone can join there and find out. But
Yeah, and we have a weekly podcast, Gratitude Blooming, and I'm
we'll add that as well.
at
Yeah.
O Brownson.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Before we wrap up, is there any final words, anything else you want to mention?
I just, you know, say thank you to someone today and say, I appreciate you. So I appreciate you, Zeneca, for holding this space and inviting me and many others to build the world we want to live in.
I love it, and thank you, and I appreciate you, Omar, just for running these gratitude circles in Zen Academy, and for being here and for chatting with me. It's been an enlightening discussion, as it always is when we talk.
Let's create some hope hype.
Hope hype. Hope-based hype. That's a good note to end on. Hope hype.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Cheers.
And there we have it. Do you feel more calm? I feel more calm. Just chatting with Omar, I think, has that just soothing effect, that calming effect. The way he speaks, the stuff he talks about, I think I found it fascinating and interesting, and I hope you did too. And yeah, definitely go check out Gratitude Blooming. We'll have links to all of the good stuff down in the description below. And if you like the content, follow him, follow me on Twitter, check out my other podcast, this, that, and the other. There's a lot of content. There's a lot of links down there. Like, follow, subscribe, etc. Appreciate you. Have a good day.